That's the Holy Trinity, which is the third eye. So by the third eye, you create three eyes, the three eyes of God, that manifest a triangle that is the origin of all the rest of the things. So they said, because we cannot see each other, we need a third option to create this unity. And what happens in the physical reality is that this electrical pulse that unifies the duality, when they collapse to each other, they shine, they create energy. So light can be only created through the duality. To see can be only created through the options of two. So we need the balance of two options in order to see something. And that light that is created is what we call the third eye. The third option is the energy that gives us clarity between duality. So the idea of a pyramid is born through this Holy Trinity of this duality separating and creating a third option where the light is found. And this third option creates another option, which creates a tetrahedron. And the tetrahedron creates another option, which is the Merkaba. And the Merkaba creates another option, which is the cube, and so on, until it creates the whole structure of the universe. And you forget about the triangle, like you cannot see it anymore. But it's constantly there in the two eyes and the third eye. The inner vision, the outer vision. And they said, when you put those two flames together, you don't create unity, you create balance in order to see the unity. And so in the Nile, at that time, they said, when you try to unify things that are trying to find balance, you can only create war. You can only create destruction. Because you are forcing one of the aspects of reality to become like the other one. You are forcing someone or something to become like you. So unity in the third dimension is not an option. Balance and harmony is an option to find the third point, which is the vision, the triangle. And that's the image of the Philosopher's Stone, of being created by a triangle that is two eyes creating one eye and the eye in the center. So this symbol was the eye of God. So this symbol was a structure that was created by the ancients to show us which was the way. Like, you cannot kill the idea of two eyes to become one. You can only create a third option, a vision of unity through these two polarities in order to see the whole, to see the flame, the divine flame. And which is this philosopher's stone. And sometimes when we say philosopher, we think about someone in an island in Greece. But philosophe means love and wisdom, love and thinking. So heart and mind, as Robert was saying. The unity between these two things creates the philosopher's stone. And it's a stone because everything is created through the mineral realm. As once we said, like, the mineral realm is the basis for all this that exists. The atomic, the molecules and everything is created by calcium, phosphorus. So it's the mineral realm, actually. And this stone is everywhere in our body. We are made of the same chemicals that all the stones are made of. So when you put philet and sophe, which is love and wisdom, together in your own stones, the ones that are created within you, you are shaping the idea of a triangle that gives you two options, two fires that usually fight to each other unless they find a third option. And what we are living, so what in the Nihilists said was, you have to learn how to weave the positive and the negative until you find the whole body. And what we are living today, not today, but always in history of humanity, is usually the one eye for one eye.
And then each eye that's in each balance then accesses the throat chakra, and they start to speak to try and convince people to see the eye that they're looking through.
Exactly.
And that's what we're having in this whole information ecology, which is so wild and crazy, and all of the propaganda that we see, this fifth generational warfare, is one side trying to hijack the voice and claim the authority of the voice. So it's this huge throat chakra activation where everybody's speaking, and they're speaking not to find the greater harmony necessarily, which would be that third eye perspective, which is, I think, where we're going. And I want to talk about what you've discovered about the throat chakra, because the world is finding its voice, but it's using that voice to try to hijack the perspective of the third eye and just say, like, so it's interesting that the voice is kind of now being activated, and what we're ultimately needing to get to is that place where there's a vision that holds the harmony of these different perspectives and holds the balance. But in the meantime, because moving from the heart to the mind is the throat, it's in there. So we're having to deal with all of these voices, some of which have good intentions, many of which do. I mean, a lot of people think that they're speaking what's right and what's true, but they're not aware that they're only speaking from their own perspective, and they're not actually able to actually then use the voice after accessing that higher perspective of harmony by taking the other perspective, like intentionally going in, taking the other perspective, seeing from that perspective. And then once you've been able to see, truly then using your voice to speak to the harmony.
That's why one eye for an eye, that sentence, an eye for an eye, it's something that have been carved in our society. Like, this is how I see it, so this is how I speak it. So this is the fight between two eyes. And actually, in order to walk straight, you need both eyes to see in one point. And that creates the vision of something that is ahead, that is not one side or the other. So we have been, in our culture, in our society, we have been taught to defend one point of view. And that point of view is only one eye, is only one option. So all the initiatic paths in the past were trying to show you that there are always and will be always two options. The thing is, how can you balance those two options? And as you said, the throat chakra being the center is because the creation is vibration. So everything that is created is vibration. So we are basically in a time that everyone has a voice, which means that we are all practicing how to become a creator, but we are still in the fight of one eye, only one eye. So I think that where we are going to experience in a long time is how can we become creators of our own reality, but understanding that acceptance of the other eye would show me the way to the third option, which is creation, which is the unity between philo and sophe.
So there's something that's occurring to me here, which goes into Norse mythology.
Yeah.
So there's the story of Odin, who has one eye. And I think there's two ways. And then Odin ultimately takes his spear, Gungnir, and he throws the spear at the enemy in the War of the Gods. He says, I see the enemy, I throw my spear. All the warriors of Valhalla rise with me. Yeah. Because I've painted the enemy. It's like a laser sight system on a guided missile, right? I've painted the enemy. I've thrown the spear. The warriors rise. And so there's two ways. There's the shadow way and then there's the light way. One way to look at it is that he's just taken one perspective. He's just got one eye. And so the shadow of that Odin story would be, I'm just taking one perspective and I'm just pointing at the enemy. This is the enemy. Warriors attack the enemy because it's just one perspective. The other perspective, which would be the light side, would be, no, actually, the symbol of Odin of the one eye is the third eye, which is the actual perfect harmony of both eyes collapsing into one, and then actually throwing the spear from that perspective of full balance, so that we have an action to take in favor of all life, in favor of universal harmony. And so it's that in and of itself is, those stories represent one way in which you can see what could happen and one way in which it could happen the other way. It's like the light side of what this Odin myth could be. And I don't think this is how it's always interpreted, but it's just occurring to me that we can fall into the shadow of it by saying, oh, I see everything. We're just closing one eye. We're not looking at that perspective. I see the Israel perspective. Oh, I see the Palestine perspective. And then let's point the spear and then let's show that. And then but what's really needed is the harmony of both of those eyes to create a third eye. And then the necessity, for some action to be taken, some way in which we can stand, and I think we're in a battle to see whether we're going to have that one-eyed perspective or whether we're going to have the unity of those eyes creating an action.
I feel like I love that Matias brought up the eye for an eye. That's straight out of the books of Moses.
Code of Hammurabi.
The Code of Hammurabi. And I think that metaphor is playing out in as stark a way as we could possibly ever imagine, in a biblical way even, which is kind of take a step back for a moment and then realize the metaphor and what is there to be learned from this. Another good example of this is the left eye of Horus. The left eye of Horus was plucked out by Set, right? So Set was the uncle of Horus. Set was the brother of Osiris. He killed his brother, right? Cut him into 14 parts. And then to avenge his father, Horus had a battle with Set, where Set plucked out his left eye, his eye of intuition, the eye that represents the moon. Now, this eye of the moon represents our ability to see this different perspective, right? So when we actually look at our physicality, the left eye connects to the right brain. So let's say you're right-handed. The left eye has an optic nerve that cuts across the optic chiasm, so it makes the form of an X, and it connects to your right brain of creativity and intuition and imagination and that dark mother place, which would be represented by an omega symbol, for example. The right eye connects to the left brain. It's the base of analysis. It's the numbers. It's the mathematics. It's the natural sciences, where the right brain is more the art, the artistry. It also represents the music. So you could say on both sides of the brain, on the right temporal lobe is the seat of music processing. The left temporal lobe is the seat of mathematical processing. So we've got these two eyes that can tap into both sides of the brain. So if you lose your left eye, you've shut off a whole aspect of yourself. You've basically shut off the feminine aspect of your brain. Whereas the masculine aspect is the rational seat, right? That says, don't take that risk, don't do this. Yes, eye for an eye, battle it out, fight it out, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when you think about the rational mind being the shape of linear lines, you could think of that as like a triangle, right? And the omega shape, like a rounded type shape. So you've got alpha, you've got the optic chiasm, where those two things meet right at the pituitary gland. It literally, the optic nerves crisscross each other right at the pituitary gland. And then that is right in front of the pineal gland. So the pineal gland sits a little bit higher in the brain than the pituitary gland does. But most people don't know, if you watch like a cine fluoroscopy of a heartbeat, you'll see the heart beating and you'll see the lungs pumping and everything around it, right? When they're doing like angiograms and stuff, you've probably seen that when you go to hospitals or to cath labs. Your brain does the exact same thing. As we breathe, our brain actually goes up and down, and it contracts like a heartbeat. Did you know that? It literally contracts and moves with a heartbeat. So when we take in a breath, the front part of our brain actually lifts and rises up so that it can get to the same plane for the pituitary, which sits slightly underneath, lower than, right, the pineal gland. So if you can raise the feminine, which is the pituitary gland, to the same plane as the pineal gland, you get an electrical connection there, right? Which that means you're basically creating in this whole area called the hypothalamus or the thalamus, also known as the wedding hall. It's called the Hall of Brahman or the wedding cave or the wedding hall. This is where you have the alchemical union occur in not only a philosophical, but in a physical sense. right? And this is when you have that entrance into an enlightened state. And what is enlightenment? What really changes for you? You've got a complete connection between the two hemispheres of the brain. You've got this third eye now that's basically been fully activated. And as a result, you start to express love, and that expression of love supersedes your desire for one objective truth. When the expression of your love for all that is supersedes your desire for that one objective truth, then you reach nirvana. And that is what I would say is what the best thing I could say would be enlightenment. And that is embodied through this Philosopher's Stone. So now if we look at the metaphor of this, so let's draw a circle in our minds and then have a square that shares the same base as that circle. Just like in the Vitruvian Man. One of the guys that's here had a Vitruvian Man tattoo on his arm. I was like really interested in it.
Yeah,
Eric. And if you just take that exact same thing, take the base of the square, use that as a base of a triangle, connect it to the top of the circle, which then is higher than the top of the square. It creates a triangle that has a very unique proportion. It's a very sharp triangle. It's like the Nubian pyramids. It's shaped about like that. It's very, very steep looking. That's the one on the dollar bill. That triangle happens to be what we call a perfect triangle. It is representing the Philosopher's Stone. So the Philosopher's Stone has two representations. One representation is an equilateral triangle. The other one is this triangle that looks like this, right? It's a very, very sharp, peaked pyramid. That one represents the sun and the moon overlapping each other. Because if you take that same circle that Da Vinci used for drawing the Vitruvian Man, the way that works, if you move the center of the square to the center of the circle, the point at the top of the circle is going to be the exact center of the moon in relationship to the earth. So the earth would be a circle beneath it, the moon would be above it, and the sun and the moon overlap in that, and it creates this one triangle that has a proportion in Pythagorean mathematics called 5, 12, 13 triple. So it has a base of 5, has a height of 12, and it has a hypotenuse of 13. This is a perfect triangle. Why do I mean it as a perfect triangle? Because it's the only triangle whose Pythagorean, base is equal in its perimeter to its area. So there's only one circle that can do this. It's a circle with a radius 2, and it has a 4 pi area and a 4 pi circumference. There's only one square that can do this. It's a square with a side length of 4. Its area is 16, and its perimeter is still 16. And all three pyramids on the Giza Plateau represent the balancing of these things. Exactly, right? So the Menkaure pyramid represents the perfect square because you take 1/2 of its base. It's a 5/4 relationship. These are musical ratios. They're musical intervals. The 5/4 relationship gives you the perfect 4 as the base for this square that gives you the perfect perimeter, perfect area. The Khafre pyramid, the pyramid in the middle, is a 4/3 relationship. That gives you a radius of 2. If you make a circle from the base to the top of the pyramid, all the way up, that gives you the perfect circle. The perfect circle has the same circumference as it does its area. In the Great Pyramid, if you take 1/2 of its base, it will have something very unique. It squares the circle. So what do I mean by that? It actually takes a 1/2 base square would have the same perimeter as the circle that goes from the base of the pyramid to the top of the pyramid. It has the exact same circumference, matching its perimeter perfectly. So then you have to ask yourself the question, where's the perfect triangle? Perfect triangle doesn't show up on the Giza Plateau. It does show up on the dollar bill, the 5, 12, 13, and it does show up 8 kilometers north of the Great Pyramid in a place called Abu Rawash that looks down on the Giza Plateau. And there are 2 pyramids there. One is an equilateral triangle, which represents the pituitary gland. And right adjacent to it is a 67.4-degree angle that represents the pineal gland. So we're talking about now ascending beyond the throat chakra, the 3 layers of the throat chakra, the Great Pyramid representing self-awareness, Khafre Pyramid representing self-actualization, being able to manifest but still be through time dependence, and then Menkaure Pyramid representing self-transcendence, the recognition of love. the recognition of love transcending above all duality. That's the final stage of the throat chakra. Once you finally hit that stage, then magic returns. But in the backdrop of the world around you, to have that beautiful light, you gave the example earlier talking about Sauron, talking about Lord of the Rings. When Gandalf the Grey became Gandalf the White, it accompanied at the exact same moment in time the building of this orc army, right? There becomes darkness. When I go to buy a diamond at a store, the first thing I do is I ask to place that diamond in front of a really dark velvet cloth because it brings out the brilliance of the diamond. The dark needs the light as much as the light needs the dark. The two are acting out in this grand plan, this grand play for us to see these metaphors, to wake up from the duality and to choose instead love.
Mm. As you share this, there's two things. One, just going back to the story of Horace, seeing through one eye is often facilitated through trauma. You have your eye plucked out. Mm-hmm. Like you receive trauma. And I think you can see this, on both sides of the current conflict. You see trauma creating a unified, unitary perspective on things. Trauma then blinds you in a certain way. And then you're seeing through only one perspective. And all of us are feeling this as well as we receive, the pain, that we receive. We receive the trauma, even if it's not first person that we've received it. Trauma then creates the inability to see beyond the trauma that we've received, and so that's another clue that's pointed not only from the ancient stories, but then the ancient structures, which the stories pass on information, whether they're stories, from the Bible, whether they're stories from Egyptian culture, stories through Norse culture, stories, all of the great stories, the stories from, I'm immersing myself in the stories of the first people of Australia, the Aboriginal people who see a relationship of love between self and the rocks. Whereas normally it's just, rocks, fucking cut them up, put them whatever, you got one, move them over here, it doesn't matter. And they're like, what are you talking about? You got to ask the rocks. The rocks want to be moved. What is and even in Hawaii, everybody knows not to take a lava rock from fucking Hawaii. And there's countless examples of like this, well, you haven't asked the rocks. You haven't talked to the rocks where they want to be. And so it's the sentience of all life. So there's wisdom that's starting to come back into our culture in many of these different ways. But all of these stories together, plus then these signposts that have been created and encoded in ways that can't be rewritten because they're actually made as these structures, right? Like stories can be retold and retold. I mean, just look at the Bible, right? A bunch of shit was cut out and a bunch of shit was added and then manipulated. And then, so you have a story that's also hijacking our information ecology about what the wisdom of Yeshua was, what the wisdom of the Hebrew wisdom traditions. I mean, Solomon's wisdom was cast out of, the Hebrew faith and is now, and we're trying to bring back the wisdom of Solomon back in. And many aspects of Hebrewism say like, no, Solomon, he was a heretic. You got to get him out. There's all of these different ways in which we can hijack stories, but the stones, the megaliths, these things where there was a deep wisdom from the ancients to say like, all right, we know what people will do with stories to make the stories fit their own ethnocentric or their own egotistic power. I mean, look at Ramses II, who just said, no, I built all this shit. It was me. All glory to me, and he's just full of shit. He created a story, but the stones tell a different story. And that was like a wisdom of the ancients. Like, oh yeah, we know people will hijack stories and try to change them. But if we encode the stories in the eternal truths, then some people will find their way, through these. And then also another way is to make the story so abstract, like mythology. Story's so abstract, nobody's going to change it. Nobody bothers to change the story of Horus. Nobody bothers to change the story of Odin. They can interpret it a different way, but it's still the story. And so what we're seeing now is both story and these artifacts that are now helping to guide us through these very confusing times, hopefully through greater and greater synergy and synthesis, and then the awareness that we can see with clarity through our third eye.
One point on Solomon. I was thinking about this week because of the eclipse that we just experienced, and I don't think it's coincidence that the eclipse happened exactly when it happened on the timeline that it did. So again, everything can look as if it's random, or everything can be completely ordered. It's our perception. Whether we perceive miracles or not is ultimately our choice. People that don't believe in miracles will never experience a miracle. That I know. And even the name Sol Amon, sol is the word for sun. A in Latin is and. Mon is moon. Sun and moon.
Mm-hmm.
The wisdom of the sun and the moon, that is the Philosopher's Stone. Solomon achieved the Philosopher's Stone.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is the symbol. And if you go deep into the codex of the Solomon wisdom, the symbol is actually represented by the moon. The sun penetrates the moon, and in its fullness, I think the Aramaic is Sihurata Bishlemunta, the moon in all of its fullness represents Solomon, penetrated by the sun, receiving that penetration of the sun, and then illuminating everything from within and casting that light to move the waters of the world. And so this is part of the deep lineage wisdom that we're recovering. And as you said, even encoded in the name itself and in this idea of how we actually move forward in balance, is allow ourselves to be penetrated by the light of the sun, and then allow that to illuminate all that's within and move the waters, from that place of both, receiving and then actually projecting, circle and line, both in its same balance and also reverence at the same time. So then we're in the process of then trying to synthesize all of these stories and all of these clues that have been left behind. But it's unbelievable and miraculous to understand how deep and ancient this wisdom came from.
And it's, as Robert was saying, mentalism, the first law of the universe. They knew, that's why I told you, we told stories in the beginning, because the stories of heroes, the stories of gods, the stories of Adam, Eve, those stories were the only ones that would survive because it nourishes imagination. So when you try to explain a truth exactly as it is, only a few people would understand it. But everyone will be related to a goddess or a god or a hero, because you can relate with your own life. So they created stories so people could remember what actually the information was, saying it is encoded, and eventually someone or some group of people will start to understand what these stories actually mean. So what happened was that we started to create religions around the stories, and we started to believe them as they were told and not what they were hiding inside. So today, because we have the ability to have all the stories together, and most of the people are kind of related to these stories by movies, by books, and you can today understand all the wisdom inside those stories through your heroes, through these other stories that are being told, that are so ancient, so old. And as you see, the Marvel is taking all the stories from the Persians, the Norse people, the Greek people. They are bringing them all back. It's like it's been thousands of years of this, and even though they are still,
it's not a coincidence either.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence. and all the discoveries and understandings, and everything is coming back. And as when we were traveling also, and some things were happening, it was all about the stories. And it's not because we are those people in the stories. Like sometimes we say, oh, maybe I am related to that person. No, it's because they are echoes, and they are not talking about the actual people in the story. They're talking about codes that we all have within. And that's why we can relate to them, and why we can awaken the information through believing that we are those people.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you think you are a god or someone in the past or this kind of thing, sometimes it's like, oh, that's very egoistic. Like you believe in you were this king or this. But actually, when you start, even if you know that you weren't, when you start saying, I am that, you somehow uncode what is behind that. Like the story of the sword of Merlin and Arthur. I had to believe myself I was one of them to understand what was behind that story.
Yeah, to see through their eyes from that perspective.
To see from their eyes. And many of those, that's why sometimes I do weird stuff, most of the time, actually.
I can attest to that.
Oh, yeah, you can be. Yeah.
But we're all weird.
Yeah, for sure. Matias is just slightly more weird.
He's taking it to another level.
But sometimes it's like, okay, I have to allow myself to become that person in order to see through the eyes and understand what is behind that. And that's why I was living so many crazy stories related to this myth, because they are all telling something that we are all living today. And if we start to relate to those stories and we say, I am Merlin, or I am Arthur, or I am Horus, or these kind of things. So we start to understand the codes behind it, because we start to see through the eyes of the story and not looking at the story.
So there's two things that I want to touch on here that were brought up that I think are very interesting. One, I want to go into the story of Arthur and Merlin and Excalibur and how that also relates to the Philosopher's Stone.
Yeah.
And also just want to get both of your perspective on this recent eclipse and this eclipse season that we're in. I felt the eclipse in a way that I've never felt anything that's happened astrologically in my life. It was one of the wildest, personal internal experiences I had during that recent eclipse. So I want to touch on, both of those different things, go deeper into the Arthurian story. And also let's, talk a bit about what happened here in the eclipse and like a way to read into that beyond what your local Instagram authority is going to tell you about the eclipse. All right, so I'll briefly share my experience of the eclipse. So I wake up and I'm kind of in the liminal space in between sleeping and being awake. And I get this like dream that comes through. And in this dream, the dream is that I had somehow done something that fucked up the timeline that we were on in the multiverse. Like I had done something that fucked up the timeline, and it was my fault that things were going awry in my life and the collective, and this feeling that my life and the collective were inextricable, which I think there's some truth to that, as within, so without, right? There is some connectivity, but the slippery part of this was this idea that I did something that was so powerful, it took the whole world onto a different negative timeline. And I was like, and I woke up, I was like, this is not true. This can't be true. But I think it wove itself into my own psyche through a vulnerability in my psyche, which is this vulnerability of the ego that wants to believe that it's all powerful and it can control everything. And I've actually seen this play out in different periods of psychosis during like an ayahuasca journey, or different ways in which people have found themselves in a quote hell. And the hell is, I am so powerful, which first you get into the psyche through the ego. I am so powerful that I did something that broke the world. And then you have all of the shame and all of the guilt that you hold that actually starts to eat you up inside. So that was the way, just call it the devil for now. Like the devil found its way in, and I've seen the devil find its way into other people's psyches with this belief. I am so powerful that I broke the world and it's all my fault. And then I've seen people move into taking actions of physical harm against themselves for that. So I go into this and then I have to like keep telling myself, no, this is not true, but it was persistent. It was like that idea found its way in until I was able to, was out in the sun and I was just feeling the sun, and just before the eclipse. And then I started to, as the eclipse happened, started to realize this trap that was set for me. in this, and then ultimately transcend the trap and say like, no, like we're on, like everything is on the right timeline. And all I have to do is believe in this new timeline, and also let go of this trap that had come in. And then I found for the first time in this, one of the most incredibly painful weeks that I'd experienced with all of the trauma that was going on in the world, I found my first feeling of peace and joy. And in this eclipse, I was in there and I felt the sun, which seemed like it was a full sun at full blast. You know, I didn't have the whatever goggles or whatever things that I could see what it was, but it was surprisingly cold as well. And I was like, this is the trippiest feeling. And it was like all the animals were quiet. Everything in the whole world kind of stopped. So I felt, from my experiences, I felt this rush of dark energy come in before it happened. And then the release of some patterns and some awareness that came in on the other side. So it was like almost this, what felt like an attack, or at least the exposure of a vulnerability that allowed me to realize things about myself and my own ego and vulnerabilities of my ego. And then also in the release of that, I found a massive experience of growth. And so that was my personal experience on the eclipse. But as I shared earlier on the podcast, I'm not a big astrology guy, though I've started to see correlations with activities within me, especially with lunar cycles and now with these solar cycles and the eclipse cycle. So it's opening my mind more and more, especially because I'm surrounded by astrologists and these things. So it's opening my mind, more and more to these possibilities, to the point where I'd have to say, like, you know, catch me a year ago. It's like, yeah, I don't believe in this shit. You make your own stars, you know. And now I'm like, fuck. Maybe I need to rethink this. I felt it. I need to rethink this position. But yeah, I just wanted to, you know, open this up.